Hello, everybody, and welcome to another community-oriented live stream for the Q project. My name is Paul Jolly. I think I've also got a few captions that we can use today, so let me get those going as well. There we go. Hopefully got the Q project caption up on the page there. As I said, my name is Paul Jolly, and today we welcome our guest, Michael Gash, to demonstrate and discuss how to use Q with GitHub Actions. But before we get started, let me just do a quick reminder of the project homepage. Lots of captions flying up there. And most importantly, our Twitter handle, which is there. We're using Twitter rather a lot these days in order to announce events like this. A new release that came out recently. So please follow Twitter. Follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with the latest news. But today, let's get back to talking about today. So what we're talking about, as I said, is Q and GitHub Actions. So the current situation is that YAML drives GitHub Actions. And as we'll see, there's fundamentally no need to actually change that. Instead, we're actually going to work with it. There's already a great deal of infrastructure and momentum built around the YAML ecosystem that drives GitHub Actions. So we're not trying to sort of work against that, instead work with it. We're certainly not here to bash YAML in any way, shape, or form. It's a very popular data serialization language. But just because the input to GitHub Actions is YAML doesn't necessarily mean we need to write YAML in order to maintain our continuous integration setup. So today's session is going to explore how to use Q to drive your GitHub Actions setup. And hopefully what we'll do today is actually present a really good practical example of how Q can be used. As you will see, there are going to be a few rough edges. We're aware of those as we're making progress towards V1 of Q. But hopefully it will give you an idea of one application of Q, Q's potential in that space, where it can help with productivity, reducing of errors and frustration to a certain extent, and generally be a delight to use. But before we go any further, let's do some introductions. As I said, my name is Paul Jolly. I'm one of the core project members on the Q project. You could follow me on Twitter. There we go. Let's do another little caption there. Indeed, as I mentioned on the previous live stream, please feel free to ping me with any questions you might have, especially those that are Q related. Or indeed, if you're thinking about contributing to the project, very happy to help out in any way, shape, or form. I'm now going to hand over to Michael to introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Paul. So Michael, I'm working for VMware in Office of the CTO as an engineer. And my day-to-day job is mostly around event-driven systems with Knative and some researchy topics on distributed systems.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And we'll come back to a couple of those 2 points in a second, I think. But let's first talk about why we're actually talking today. Back in December, I think it was December the 2nd, actually, I gave a talk about a short lightning talk about how the Q project uses GitHub in combination with GitHub Actions. And that sort of gives us what is for us, if you like, the code review and continuous integration system of choice. But Michael, you rightly pointed out that in my 10-minute lightning talk, I was a bit light on detail as far as how Q actually works with GitHub Actions. And then you sort of lay down a bit of a challenge to me.
True, yeah. I mean, I really liked the talk. And obviously it was a lightning talk, so I didn't expect much detail. But I was intrigued to get more to know of the stuff that you build for your pipelines, because I'm also using GitHub Actions a lot.
Fine. So but let's just stress, though, today we're not actually going to be talking about GitHub at all, just plain vanilla GitHub, specifically GitHub Actions, as we'll see in the demo in a bit. That said, if you do use GitHub in a setup similar to what we use with the Q project, then you'll be able to use exactly these same techniques because they apply. It's more sort of a function of it being GitHub Actions than the source control system that drives it. Michael, how did you actually come across? Let's just talk briefly about how you came across Q in the first place. What was it that sort of? How did you find the project, and what piqued your interest in it?
It was through Solomon Hykes, the creator or co-creator of the Docker project back in the days. And so he gave a talk, I think last year, I'm not sure, last year or this year at DockerCon, where he talked about his new project that he's working on. I think that's called Dapper, not the Microsoft Dapper, but the
it's Dagger. Dagger.
Oh, Dagger. Sorry,
yes,
yeah, Dagger.
Dagger.
Exactly. And he fell in love with Q. And so I looked at it, and it was really crazy what he did with Q to like do all the scaffolding and the project management in terms of like the schemas. And that's where I saw Q. I think it was last year, actually. Must have been last year then. And then I just poked with it. I looked at it, how I could be using Q. So I played a little bit with it. I had a steep learning curve, to be honest, because like it's completely changed the way I think about schemas and defining schemas. But after the learning curve, I had a good experience with it because it really helped to spot like syntax errors and schema errors and most of the YAML stuff.
Yeah, well, it's the Dagger folks heavily use Q, and we're actually looking forward to getting them on at some point to talk about how the Dagger project uses Q, because it's a really good example of how, from a workflow perspective, Q can be leveraged as well. And similarly, the Qvela project uses that workflow setup as well. But today we're not, even though we're sort of talking about GitHub action workflows, we're not talking about the workflow part of Q. As you sort of alluded to there, we're going to be talking more about the schema and validation side of things. So why don't let's just jump straight into looking at a project. If I can just share my screen here. There we go. Fantastic. We've created this simple little project. Hopefully that's large enough. Michael, I don't know whether you're able to see on your screen there whether that looks fairly reasonable.
Maybe one more.
One more, okay.
One more zoom. Yeah,
let's go to. Let's be generous.
That's good.
Great. And so what we're going to talk about here is this is just a plain vanilla GitHub Actions example at the moment. As you can see, it's actually a Go project. So we've got a go.mod file at the root with a main.go. Nothing particularly exciting about the Go part of it. But let's just jump into the workflow specification, which you can see is 2 YAML files here. Let's just point out a couple of things. Well, you can see, first of all, that there's 2 workflows in this situation. I've just called them something very generic like workflow 1 and workflow 2 for the sake of keeping things simple. Within workflow 1, nothing particularly to point out, apart from the fact that there are 2 jobs. Here we go, let me highlight it that way there. That will run sequentially, because you'll see in a second we've got job 1 and then job 2, and job 2 actually needs job 1 to complete before it actually runs. And within job 1 we've got a matrix going on here, so that it's going to run for a couple of Go versions across 3 different platforms. It's going to run bash shell as part of the runner, I think it's called. Jump in if I get any of this stuff wrong, Michael. I'm no expert on the terminology for sure. Then it's going to install Go, check out the code, run Go tests, and then just run something according to main.go. It looks like it's going to print something out as part of that.
Paul Jonathan just says he could do 1 or 2 plus zoom.
2 plus zoom.
GitHub. Yeah, I don't know if that's was before the zoom that you did. Might come async because the zoom is a little bit the YouTube is a little bit blind, but that's good.
I'll give it a go. I've just given it 1 more there. So thank you. Yeah, and then so this entire matrix needs to complete first of all, and then job 2, because of this dependency relationship needs here, will kick in, and this is just going to echo done. So this is just a very simple way of saying, right, we're all finished. It clearly doesn't do anything useful. Let's go back and jump and look in workflow 2. So this is actually not running within a matrix on this one here. This is just going to run on Linux. Again, a bash shell here, and a number of steps here that actually look almost identical to the first workflow. So this is, I think, what I was looking to try and do here is actually emulate that sometimes, even though you might have 2 separate workflows, you end up having a lot of duplication between those workflow specifications. So it's a bit artificial in this situation, but hopefully it gives the idea. The message is slightly different here, at least in this one. It says from workflow 2, and I think the other one said from workflow 1.
Yeah, this is also very much in line with what I experienced on GitHub Actions, which is typically we break out our Go suite into like unit tests, integration tests, end-to-end tests to like maximize parallelism, right?
Yep.
But then, as you said, there's a lot of boilerplate and duplication, installing Go, setting up Go, downloading some dependencies that you always need, and all this stuff.
Yes.
So it's not sometimes, it's actually more often that you see this duplication.
Well, exactly. One thing I forgot to point out is that the use of, hopefully my selection on screen is clear there. I think these are called contexts in GitHub Actions, where you use this dollar and then it looks like sort of go template style substitution that happens at runtime when the actual workflow itself kicks off. And here it's referring to the matrix. Well, actually, this should break. So this will, here's an interesting example. This is an error in the specification because, of course, there's no matrix in this situation here. So interesting to see what this will actually do at runtime in terms of what the output will be there. So that was totally unintentional, but I've sort of flagged something interesting, of course, because this has not been caught in any way, shape, or form. Let's quickly jump back to workflow 1 and see if there's anything interesting as part of that one there. Yeah, so here we go, using a context here for matrix.platform for the runs on. And then matrix.go version, that is valid in this situation. Okay, great. And then, of course, that matrix.go version will be valid there.
That's a good point. I hit this many times where I just copy pasted, but I forgot a block. And so the reference is non-existent.
Well, the most painful thing for me actually in preparing this example was getting the YAML right to start with. The number of white space errors was shocking, which is probably more reflection of my lack of confidence and familiarity with YAML than anything else.
But no, you could argue, Paul, that there is schema linters for GitHub Actions and there's YAML linters. So wouldn't that help already? Like
it would, yeah. And to be fair, I think that's really my bias there, is I haven't got my editor set up for YAML for the schema in question here. We'll come to that in a second, because as we discussed in our warm-up session, there is a JSON schema that specifies what is a valid GitHub workflow. And so, of course, we could be using that within our editor. But what we're looking at today is actually how Q leverages that JSON schema and Q-based workflows around this. So it's not to say that there aren't other techniques, and JSON schema is a valid one. And the GitHub Actions folks have published a valid JSON schema that we will actually leverage as part of this. What other things do you find challenging, if you like, Michael, about the sort of the YAML-based workflow in this situation?
Well, understanding obviously what are the options. Sometimes you have options in the GitHub Actions workflow definition that are at the job level, at the step level. From time to time I go back and need to check the documentation of where the obviously you have the schema. The schema would flag some of the stuff, but we have caught some corner cases, right? I think you'll get back to them as well, where the schema doesn't really help you in that case. The other one is context. You already mentioned context, so GitHub. So there's the GitHub context, like the GitHub dot something, and I can never remember what is in the context besides like the standard fields that I'm using. And then also there's conditional logic and operators, where you can like if, for example, is like if true or if success or if failure. Like I can never remember these conditionals. So I really have the tab open for the documentation, and this is multiple pages. It's not just one page. One page is for the YAML, the other one is for the conditions, the other one is for the conditional expressions, and then for the context. So understanding the workflow. And then from time to time, obviously, I just copy and paste. And then I forget. So if I need to make adjustments, I can forget. And basically, it's a full reset, cache flush, and reading the docs again.
Yeah, I think one of the main things for me is actually the maintenance of YAML. So if I come to an existing project, or I want to sort of copy paste some YAML from elsewhere, I find it incredibly difficult then to sort of copy and paste from one place to another, then get the white spacing right. Again, I'm probably reflecting more naivety there around good tools that exist around it. But as I'll show, the sort of very strong native tooling with Q that makes maintenance like a number one priority citizen, if you like, within the setup. And what we will have with language server protocol support in the editor as well, is then you'll have native support for formatting, kind of to your point, things like code completion, error linting. It'll all be there automatically within the editor for you. So that'll make the experience incredibly connected, if you like, with what it is you're doing. In this case, we're writing a GitHub Actions workflow. So it would be suggesting for you what the options are at any given point. telling you where errors are, having documentation to hand, all of these sorts of things will actually then mean that you've got that in-editor experience going on. So that should help a lot.
I think one challenge to point out, which Q really helps with, is the feedback loop. Yep. Because if, for example, in your schema or in the YAML definition, the schema does not catch like a typo in a string, for example, that you have like in a run, for example, then you will notice only by deploying this in the runner. Like it takes time, right? It queues up. So there's a couple of minutes that in between you catching the error versus more strict validation that Q can provide.
Indeed. So I think JSON schema could help with that in some respects, but I think as we'll show, that the experience of actually writing schemas in Q and just getting started is something that is fundamentally quicker in Q than JSON schema. JSON schema to me is, I literally have to refer to the spec every time I try and write a schema. And it's, again, there's probably tooling that helps with these things. But so I think it's more an indication of the fact that Q to me is, and of course I'm going to be biased, a more natural thing to get started, because you can have the schema and the data sitting alongside each other. And we'll see that a bit later on as well. I think one of the challenges for me particularly is lack of reuse between projects. I can't think how many times I've written effectively the same YAML between different projects, and just want like my standard library, for want of a better phrase, of GitHub Actions stuff. I don't know whether you can relate to that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a bit of tooling that GitHub gives you, which is like at organizational level, defining some of the workflows and then pushing them down into projects or using templates. I think they also recently released, I might be wrong there, but they might have released like inclusion syntax where you can reference another workflow as part of your workflow. I would have to look that up. I mean, I think that came recently, but it's definitely not as granular as saying just using snippets or name snippets or like standardizing specific parts of the schema that you can reference.
Yeah, we'll hopefully see as well. We don't have full package management support within Q yet, but it'll be clear where that, effectively how that would help in what we're going to do later on. We've done quite a lot of talking. We're 15 minutes in. Should we just get down to taking a look at this? What I'm going to do is I'm just going to be working with a Q version that I've downloaded from the project page. And as you can just see, I click through from Qlang to the GitHub page, and then within releases here, for everybody's benefit, I'm going to be using 0.4.1 beta 6 for this version here. So let me just jump into my terminal. And Michael, hopefully this is clear enough to you as well. I think I
can see it. Maybe 2 more zooms. Yeah, a little bit more zoom, please.
I'm going to struggle to do that with my terminal setup here.
This is a Mac?
It is. Well, it's not. It's actually VMware Fusion within my Mac.
Does Command Plus work?
I'm at the max on that. Let's see.
I can see it on the iPad. I can read it as well. But
are you on an iPad?
Yeah.
Can you read it on yours?
Yeah.
Let's just make sure that we don't do too much here without.
I can see it on my iPad.
You can see it on the iPad. We'll give this a go. I think on the last live stream, this was a decent-ish size, so we'll give it a shot at this here.
Yeah.
So as I said, I'm just using this Q version here. Oh, actually, that's not the one I'm using. So let's just use that. 0.4.1 beta.6 Q version. That is interesting. This is fine. This is let me just quickly build the latest version of Q. Q 0.4.1 beta.6.
People say it's fine, the size.
Perfect. That's kind. Thank you, everybody, for reporting that. So here we go. This is effectively the same version as 0.4.1 beta.6. It's the same commit. So that's what I'll be using for today. And you can see where I am is I'm in this directory here, GitHub Actions example, which is just a clone of the project that I had that we were just looking through a second ago. This one here, for anybody who wants to follow along with that. So first of all, what we're actually going to do is part of this is we're going to say, fine, we've got those existing YAML workflows as we saw. So as quickly as possible, we're going to import those and convert them to Q. And the best way to do that is to actually create ourselves a Q module, and you'll see why in a second. Q modules, for those who are familiar with Go modules, are effectively the unit of source code interchange. They're also the unit for versioning, but critically, they are the mechanism effectively for resolving imports that are not part of the main module. So what we'll do in a second, let's just define ourselves a module, Q module. So I've just did go list -m to say what is the Go module that we're part of here, and that's what I'm going to call my Q module as well. So Q mod init. There we go. And so now what that will have done is created, we don't need, that's just created as a q.mod, as we can see there. Okay. And what we're now going to do is we're going to quickly jump back to our browser, schemastore.org. And this is where I was referring earlier on to the fact that the GitHub folks have published a JSON schema that represents the GitHub Actions workflow. And this is very hard for me to understand, JSON schema. But at the same time, it is going to form the basis. Again, it doesn't really matter. It's a structured version of a schema. And what Q can do is it can actually import that JSON schema, and we can work with it in Q. So that's what we're actually going to do in this situation. So let's just jump back to our... So the plan is we're going to import that schema first of all. So what we're going to do is I'm going to assume, first of all, q.mod package, and I'll just explain this in a second, schema store.org GitHub. So as I said, the Q module is the means by which Q resolves imports that are not part of the main module. And in this situation, as you saw, the Q module that we've actually created is github.com q-lang GitHub Actions example. And what we want to do is actually, we want to define a module effectively, an import, a package import, where this GitHub Actions JSON schema can be resolved from. And you'll see this in action in a second. So effectively what I'm doing here is just putting in place the building blocks for that. So I've created a directory for it. And now I'm just going to change into that directory. And here is actually one of the first rough edges that we're going to run into here. It looks like the tip version, the latest version of that JSON schema specification, it isn't playing very nicely with Q at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get hold of a previous commit of that GitHub workflow JSON. And if we just take a look at that here, that's exactly this. It's effectively an earlier version of the JSON schema that I clicked through to from the schema store. So now what we're going to do is, we've got this this JSON schema here. Q can now import this. So what we're going to do is, let me just first of all write the command itself. So Q import is the means by which we're going to do that. And we want to effectively place this, the JSON schema specification, underneath a definition that we're going to call workflow. And we're going to put it in the package GitHub here. And we're going to say that what we're effectively reading in here, we don't need to necessarily be explicit about this because Q can detect it. But we're going to say is we're reading in JSON schema, and it's going to come from GitHub workflow JSON schema file here. So we can see here that's actually created us a Q file. So let's just take a quick look at that. You can see it's put it in the package GitHub at the top there. And this is a definition in Q speak. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. I'd encourage anybody who's interested in having a look at Q itself and understanding a bit. Michael, you've had a bit of a play with Q, so you might well be familiar with what a definition is. It effectively represents a schema that against which we want to validate in this situation. Definitions have different uses, but in this situation, we're going to use it like a schema. So here is the Q encoding of that JSON schema that we just imported. So this is nice because now we can see in sort of Q form what a valid GitHub workflow actually looks like as well. So let me just check what we're going to do next. Fine, so we can now jump out of here. Michael, interrupt if there's anything that's not clear or anything at this point.
Yes, so one question. Is it like with Go where the folder name has to match the package name?
That's a very good question. It doesn't have to match. There are, in Q, can actually have multiple packages in the same directory, but I will skip over that detail for now. So what I've tried to do here, as you can see, effectively packages, this is like Go path in some respects. The module path here for what we just imported is JSON schema, json.schemastore.org/GitHub. And then within that, as you saw, we've said that this queue, we've created a queue package within there, defined a queue package that is called GitHub. So in this situation, just as you said, the final element in the module path matches the package path that we've declared. We'll see that in action. It's not a requirement because there are ways around that. And as I said, you can have multiple packages in the same directory, which is sort of like a further complication, but we don't need to worry about that here. But best practice would be to suggest that you have a package that follows the directory name in which it's contained as well.
Cool.
For simplicity.
And then there's a question from Jonathan. We haven't forgotten you, which is, and you can, I think you can come back to this later, which is most people will have existing workflow files, GitHub Action workflow files.
Yeah.
How does the migration / coexistence look like? Because, for example, you might want to start with one particular workflow and not touch the other ones. I think we'll put this in the backlog for now. Just and come back.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm going to import all of them as part of this demo here, but you absolutely don't need to, and that the two could quite happily coexist. And you'll see. So that allows you to sort of introduce queue via the back door if you like, and only partially as well. So you don't need to do a whole hog translation.
Cool.
So let's just take a look where we are here. There's nothing. Let's just create some commits as we go here. I'm just going to push them up and validate them as well. So we've added, I'm going to call it a vendor of GitHub, of imported GitHub Actions workflow schema.
And Jonathan had this question, should we persist the JSON file or the schema or not?
That is a very good question. We should for now, and that's why I just called it a vendor in quotes. Let me just show you the commit message there. If you look at the q.mod directory, the q.mod directory is what not only defines the Q module, but at the moment it is very like the Go concept of a vendor. So all of your dependencies actually have to live within the q.mod directory at the moment, specifically in the q.mod pkg directory. Broadly speaking, there is actually a sort of a caveat to that, which is why I place these files within there. That's just me vendoring effectively these. Now, when we properly land package management support for Q, there will be the equivalent of QGet, which allows you to resolve from the internet, just in the same way that you can with Go code, go get modules that exist out there, and then use packages within them. At which point, this quotes vendoring will no longer be necessary. So this is that's an excellent question, because it's effectively, this is obviously very cumbersome having to do this by hand. It is clearly a stopgap solution that enables sort of Q to make some progress in sort of various different ways. Full package management support will totally obviate this. You won't need to have this vendor at all. You certainly won't need to commit it unless you choose to, in much like the same way that you can choose to commit vendored Go code as well. Great. Okay, so we've got a clean. So you'll see me using a number of aliases. Sorry, GS for me is effectively just Git Status. So I'm just checking that I've got a. So let's also just quickly jump over to the repository itself and check the action status, because there we go. I'm just checking basically as we go here. This is a lazy version of me validating that I haven't broken anything. I'm just going to push these commits up as we go and ensure the workflows are still working. Okay, great. So now we've created effectively a vended import of the GitHub Actions workflow schema. Now what we want to do is actually convert the workflows themselves. So let's go into the GitHub workflows. There we've got our two YAML files. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use our friend QImport again. And we're going to put these in a package that we're going to call workflows, because that's the directory that we're within. Seems to make sense. And what we actually want to do is, if you think about it, these two files exist sort of totally independent of each other, in that one workflow is specified in one file and another is specified in another file. Actually, in Q, what we're going to do is we're going to create a single package. So we actually sort of need to define a namespace within which these two workflows can coexist, because they can't sort of exist at the same level, because they are going to conflict, and we'll see that in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the strings built in here to replace. So I'm going to tell it basically, with the thing that you're importing, I want you to put it in this place here. So if we look within let's just have a quick look here. 1 second. We have a name field as part of each workflow. here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that as the basis for where it's going to place it. So let me just show you that, and then it'll kind of make sense. So we're going to replace spaces and names with nothing. We're going to replace all of them. And we're going to do style.yaml. Hopefully that then worked. So now let's have a look at workflow1.q. There, so it's put it in package workflows, and as you can see, it's stuffed it under a field that's called workflow1. So workflow1 is now defined under the field workflow1, and similarly, if we have a look in workflow2.q, great, it's done the same for workflow2 as well. So one thing we can quickly do is we've now got these two Q files here. What we can do is we can actually do a Q eval, and dot means current directory. And so, yep, that's output pretty much what we'd expect. If you squint hard enough, in fact, what we can do is we can do a Q export ---- out YAML, the current directory. And this will then look very similar to those effectively two YAML files concatenated together, because we just told it to export the package that is the current directory. And within that, as you saw, we've got one field that is workflow1, and the value on the right-hand side of that is effectively the first workflow schema, the first workflow, and workflow2, which is the second one there. Great. Okay, so we've now got our Q version.
Paul, just briefly to recap for people not familiar with the Q subcommands. So
yes.
Eval basically checks the definition for integrity. Is that correct?
It's a good question, actually. Eval is a bit of a funny one that's actually going to go away. I sort of wish I didn't show eval today. Q import should be obvious. Q export should be obvious. It's the opposite of import. And as you saw when I was using it there, I was telling it to say, well, fine, Q export, I want you to take what is in the current package, the configuration that is in the current package, and I want you to render that as YAML, which is what I did there. Q eval is sort of a funny one. It's halfway between exporting and halfway between showing me the definitions that exist. And what it does is its default is to output Q. And so it's effectively rendering in Q form the configuration in the current package, the current directory, which is why you see these two concatenated one after the other, and which is why you see them specified in terms of Q here as opposed to output and YAML. What we can do is we can say Q output export -- out JSON. Oops, let me type that correctly. And there we go. There's the JSON representation of it as well.
Nice.
Exactly the same way, which is why, this is actually makes it very, very clear, right? The outer brace here on the JSON indicates this is effectively a single object, a single configuration that we are rendering here. And it's the combination of the multiple Q files in the current package. That's what's going on.
Makes sense. So Oliver has a question. Well, Jonathan first, because Jonathan said when the commands are being put like at the bottom of the terminal, he can't see the commands. So please Control-L to delete.
Hang on, let me turn off names. I suspect that is probably what's going on. Apologies.
Yeah, because of Twitter. Yeah, much better.
Sorry, I hadn't thought about that.
Cool.
Let me also try and do the commands nearer the top as well.
Yes, that's cool. And then when you did the strings replace, there's a question. Oliver missed basically what it was doing, like the syntax there.
Yeah, so if you think about it, what we're trying to do in this situation is we've got multiple YAML files that are, for want of a better phrase, they're like sort of separate configurations. There's no concept of a YAML file, as far as I'm aware, at least spanning multiple files. And I'll thankfully be corrected there if there is a concept of includes that exists natively within YAML. But so let's just, for this purpose here, at least these workflow specifications, there's a single workflow specification in each YAML file, basically. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, imagine taking multiple workflows and combining them in a single namespace. And that namespace is effectively our package. And specifically, it's the workflows package in this situation. So we need to say, well, you can't put all of these at the top level because they're going to conflict. Let's just have a quick look. We have a look at workflow1.q, and on the right-hand side, workflow2.q. Imagine these were sort of the same level. You'd have, the values of the on field would not conflict because they're the same, but you'd immediately have a problem with the name field because you'd be saying, well, the name is workflow 1, and well, the name is also workflow 2. But in fact, what we have is we have two configurations here. So we need to namespace them. We need to put them under fields that effectively identify what they are. So that's why I've called them workflow 1 here, and this is the workflow 1 specification in Q, and here's workflow 2. And so the way you can do that, so let me just clear the screen again, say Q imported, say, well, fine, when I'm importing from these YAML files here, and let me just show you, we do it this way, Q help import. The -L flag here, which is also -- path, basically is telling Q when you come across an object, where should you put it? And each YAML file represents a separate object in this situation. So let's just clear that again. And so I'm telling it to place it, using the L flag, I'm trying to place it at a place that is identified by the name field, and that's the name field that you saw within the workflow specification. But of course, it's easier for me to refer to it if that doesn't have spaces in. So I've told it to replace spaces with effectively the empty string throughout that name value, which is why when we then look in workflow 1.q, it exists a workflow 1 there, as opposed to, let me just make it clear, if I didn't have that string.replace there, I just said the name field, that would be the name of the field. But that, to my mind, is a little less pretty to actually read, and it's also more tricky to work with as well. Hence, I just took the spaces out of the name there. And I by luck of, given how I've named these workflows, I have something that is a valid identifier in this situation as well. Hopefully that answers the question, but please feel free to shout if it doesn't. You said there was another question as well?
No, we're good.
Okay, great. Perfect. Let's crack on. So we've now imported our YAML files into Q files. Now what we actually want to do is we want to take that Q specification and actually output it to YAML again. So let's just do a quick git status. Fine. All we've done is we've added these two Q files for now. So what we're now going to do is create a tool file. And what a tooling layer specification does in Q is allow you to define some commands that actually do things with Q configurations. So again, let's just have a quick look. I'm just going to call it CI, and then it's the _tool.q that identifies it, especially as effectively a tooling layer command file. So we're just going to call this package workflow. It's going to put it in the same place. And we're going to define a command in this situation. I'm just going to call it gen workflows. And what we're going to do is, hang on, before we do this, I need to go back out 1 second and do something else. So before the workflow, we've got these two Q files here. We actually need to combine them in some way to actually be able to reference workflow 1 and workflow 2. So what I'm going to do is say package workflows, and I'm going to define a field, workflows, and what do we want this to be? We're going to say that this is going to be a list in this situation, and we're going to say this file name, and let's just say workflow1.yaml. You'll see this will be clear what I'm actually doing in a second. And workflow1, and then we're going to have file name workflow2.yaml and workflow2. So ignore the file name for 1 second. We'll come back to that in a second. But here I'm just creating another field, workflows, that I'm defining to be a list. And within it, effectively, it's a list of pairs in this situation of a file name and the corresponding workflow. So this is me referring to the workflow that we just imported. I'm going to save that. And now this gives us something as the basis for our tool file to actually generate automatically in a file by this name the contents of this workflow here. So let's actually go and do that. So as I said, I'm going to call this CI tool.q workflows, and I'm going to define a command which is gen workflows. And what I'm going to now do is say for each workflow, so for W in workflows, that was the field that I just defined workflows there. So I want to effectively range over that using comprehension. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a field, and I'm going to call the field because each field here is going to need to be unique. So I can use the file name in this situation because that will be unique. I'm going to do a file.create in this situation. So we're going to need to import that. I'll explain this in a second. Tool, file. We're going to go to create, and we're going to say the file name is going to be w.file, file name. And the contents of the file are going to be, what do we want to do? We want to yaml.marshal in this situation of w.workflow. And so we also need encoding YAML at the top there. Fine, so what's actually going on here? We're just defining ourselves a command, gen workflows. And within that command, what it does is for every workflow, it's going to create a file which has the file name that corresponds to the file name field. So let's just have workflows open below. And the contents of that file are going to be the YAML marshaled version of the workflow field. And in this situation here, you can see workflow for workflow1.yaml. That's going to be workflow1, unsurprisingly, etc., etc. So this is basically some equivalent to a bash file, a bash script that's just allowing me to very simply define in Q speak a command that generates YAML files. So,
Paul, just one
go
question.
ahead. Yeah.
Line 10, the backslash and then the parenthesis around.
Very good question. Thank you. Sorry, I skipped over that too quickly. So here we're just ranging over the workflows. And what we're doing is when you have a comprehension like this, so this for loop here is effectively a comprehension that allows me to define multiple fields. But each field within this struct here, the outer one, needs to be uniquely named. So I need to give it a unique name. And conveniently in this situation, the file name I know is going to be unique. Otherwise, we just have problems in any case, right? If we're outputting the same workflow, different workflows to the same file, we've got problems. So here, this is me actually declaring a field. And this is effectively an interpolation. And I'm saying I want the name of the field to be, and so this is what the backslash and then the parenthesis means. It's an interpolation. Now I'm allowed to refer to a Q identifier here, which is W, this W up here, w.filename. So then I'm saying what that field is, it's a file.create. And this is a special tooling thing, which is where tool file comes in. So that's what the file reference is there. And so I'm effectively creating an instance of that command here, where the file name is w.filename, and the contents is the YAML marshaled version of the workflow. So let me run it, and then I'll prove to you that it actually works in this situation. So the way we're going to run that is to say Q command gen workflows. Now, nothing happened, which is good. And even better, if I do git status, even better. The YAML hasn't changed either, which is great. So that's pretty comforting because, of course, we imported the YAML to Q, and running that command has actually re-exported it to YAML, and the YAML is unchanged, which is a nice situation to be in. So I think I'm going to actually commit this now. Imported, first cut of imported Q workflows and gen workflows command.
So just timing-wise, we have 17 minutes left.
Okay.
And Jonathan has a question, and I think this might be a question related to Q. So he said, line 12 refers the content field on line 12 refers to something which is itself an onwards reference to the imported underlying content, right? I think, let me try to explain this in my noob Q terms. So file.create is a Q object.
Yeah, so file.create is effectively just a special, it's a special struct in this situation.
Struct, yes.
Exactly.
And you merge it. And
yeah, indeed. And so we're unifying it here.
Yes,
with a struct that we're passing in. And so what we're doing in this situation is this file.create, if we went to have a look at the definition of it, would say file name is a field of type string and contents is of type string or bytes. And in this situation, we're telling it, well, actually, the file name is this concrete string value here. And the contents are going to be the YAML marshaled version of this here.
Yes.
And then actually, since it's a command, exactly when that command actually comes to run, the file is written out. Okay.
So command is a magic word? Command is a magic word?
It is, yes. So if you
good.
want a bit more information on this, Q help command, and that will tell you effectively all about this tooling layer and how to specify commands. And so, as I said, this is a way of, you've got a Q configuration. Q itself is hermetic. You can't have side effects as a result of evaluating a configuration. So that's where this tooling layer comes in. And that's what we've just done. We've defined a command within the tooling layer. As I said, that comes defined within files that are underscore tool.q. So let's crack on. So now we've got, let's actually do one thing more here. So let's go back to our workflow.q. And as you remember, this is where we defined our workflows field here. Let's actually validate that we have, according to the imported schema, valid workflows as well now. So what we're going to do is going to import json.schema. Let me get this right, schemastore.org/GitHub. And we're going to say that workflows is now, what is it? It's an arbitrary length list. So that's the ... of objects that have a file name of type string, and a workflow that is github.workflow. I think that should be good for us. Give ourselves another terminal here. So qvet is effectively equivalent to govet, and it's just saying, show me correctness. Perfect. So I just ran qvet there, which is basically saying this change that I made here, this is a further constraint on the workflows field. It's saying that the workflows field is a list of any length, which is the ... of structs, which are pairs, file name string, and field workflow that is of type github.workflow. So now what qvet is doing on the right-hand side here, it's validating, well, are these things here on the right-hand side, are they actually consistent with the schema? And they are. So in this situation, we're not seeing any errors because they are consistent. So this is immediately our dev feedback loop that you talked about earlier on, Michael.
Nice.
So I feel comfortable with this. So add constraint on github.workflow. Let's just put that in. Again, I'm just going to quickly check that our these are good. Yeah, they're all running cleanly, so that's good. So now what we're going to do is we've done a demo of Q export. We did that earlier on. So let's just have a quick look at workflow 1 and 2 now, and just to have a look at some of the sort of redundancy we've got within here. As we said earlier on, one of them is this here, the default run shell bash. It's actually the same between the two of them. So that doesn't seem ideal that we actually have to specify it in both. So let's dry that up to use the parlance. And within workflows, workflows file, what we're going to do is we're going to define a hidden definition because it's just for use within this package here. So we'll keep it hidden. We call it a bash workflow. And within a bash workflow, we're saying that whatever job gets defined within a bash workflow, we will say that the defaults run shell is going to be bash. Okay, great. And now I'll show you this in action in a second. So we're going to say that workflow 1 is a bash workflow. Oops. And so here we're unifying that with what we then specify. And this is where we can use a tool called qtrim. So now that we've said that workflow 1 is a bash workflow, and it's unified with all the detail effectively that follows, let's see how qtrim can tidy this up. Oh dear, what have I done there? That did not go well. 1 second. So let me just check that I've got this right. So we just want this to be a github.workflow, and that. Sorry, that was the problem. I hadn't specified that this is effectively an instance of a GitHub workflow. So that will be the issue. So now if I run qtrim, so now we see a diff. Let's open up, let's see what the diff is. So we've got changes in workflows, which we can account for, and a change in workflow 1, which we can partially account for, I suspect. workflow1.queue. We do a diff. So the diff at the top we can account for because that was me specifying that workflow1 is an instance of bash workflow. But you can see that it's dropped the defaults run shell bash from both of the jobs that are within there. So effectively, qtrim has been smart and it said, well, I know that workflow1 is an instance of a bash workflow, so I can actually drop that. And let's do the same for workflow2.queue, and we will make that bash workflow qtrim, and we will have the same. So if we look at quickly workflow2.queue, yes, we don't have that bash reference in there other than it's just saying it's an instance. So there, we've already done some, Q has helped us with qtrim to do some tidying up and drying up of the code by just specifying it within, as we saw there within workflows.q. Yeah, we've extracted that common logic to bash workflow.
Paul, this now means that effectively the defaults, like if you want to overwrite this is not possible because the schema is hard locked to bash now, right?
Correct, yeah. So we could use a default there. We won't do that for this demo, but you could use a default in that situation to say that if it's not specified, default to bash. Absolutely. So let's just do this. Let's commit this, defined bash workflow. Okay, what's another thing that we should do here? So one thing that if we actually want to define a few more interesting steps, one, this is sort of another rough edge. We can refer to the GitHub workflow schema here, but there isn't defined within the imported schema actually a way to refer to a job or a step. So we need to actually work around that for now. And I'm just going to paste in here, and this is one of these things where there is a bit of copy-paste because there's a rough edge whilst we work out how best to do this within Q. This will allow me to refer to, just ignore what's on the right-hand side. It's effectively an internal way of saying I'm defining a local job definition to be the instance of the schema that is part of the imported GitHub workflow specification, and similarly for step as well. So let's actually use these here by taking, let's go into workflow1.queue, and let's having a look at install go, and let's make a step of our own here because we have some redundancy. Effectively, we specify this twice in workflow1 and workflow2. So let's jump back to workflows, and what we're going to do is we're going to define install go to be a step, and we're going to say, if we just go to workflow1.queue, I'm actually just going to rip out of here. And I'm going to say that the name is going to be that. It's going to use that field there, but instead of specifying what the actual Go version is, I'm going to say it's a string. So that actually has to be specified by, if you like, the caller. Now let's use this within here. Let's first of all sort out our list so that we can actually see what we're doing. And I'm just doing a bit of tidying up for readability's sake here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to first of all replace this with install go, and we want to say that the with go version, and in this situation we want it, well actually let's just copy paste that from there, and then we can delete that. So hopefully if I actually run q command gen workflows, we've got a bit of a diff in workflow 1 and workflow 2 in this situation. Let's have a quick check. It's probably just an ordering thing. Yes, it is in this situation. Okay, that's absolutely fine. So that worked. So now let's actually use install go in here as well. Again, I'm just going to start by doing, I prefer to read these things and I don't have a commands to automate the reformatting like that. And so we're just going to use install go, and in this situation we're going to have hard-coded that. So then we can delete that step there. So again, this might feel like a small thing, but again, it's if you have multiple workflows where you're needing to specify this stuff, we now just have consistency amongst all of them as to how these are actually used. So let's just do q command again to make sure that we're good. And Let's just say defines install go step. I'll push that up as well. Let's just verify.
Paul, Jonathan has a question to this workflow actually. What your tooling workflow, which is you run command, you generate the new YAMLs, and then you push them into like a PR, right? And then it gets reviewed and all the stuff.
I'm actually just pushing to the default branch main here.
Yes.
I'm being lazy. Yeah.
Yes, fine. So his question is that the workflow that we should be doing, or should we automate this with another pipeline or an action like a meta action?
It's a good question. I mean, it's kind of whatever works for you. And if you're converting a GitHub action workflow like this, whatever works for you. A PR would seem the most sensible to me because, of course, you clearly don't want to be pushing to the default branch. And if you try and do this as multiple steps within a PR, it would work in exactly the same way. So that would be entirely fine.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, just checking on time. Do you have how tight are you on the deadline of the hour? Do you have something afterwards?
A little bit, like maybe 10 more minutes. So
okay, fine. I'll push on from here because I want to be sensitive to your time. So we've defined that. We could do the same for checkout code. So let's do that. And we could do the same for checkout code, go test, and go run. Let's just quickly do that. So what I'm going to do is workflows.queue. And I'm going to do checkout code in exactly the same way. As it's going to be a step. And I just use an existing workflow here. So I'm just going to borrow this and make that a specification there. Then on the right-hand side, I'm going to say checkout code. And I can delete that. I can do the same within workflow 2, because of course that's also using it as well. Oops. Excuse me. Checkout code. And of course, in this situation, I don't need to unify it with anything because effectively I'm just using it as a template in this situation. Do the same with go test. The step. And again, the use of this, the step here is helping me to validate that what I'm unifying it with is actually a valid step as well. So this is all in the name, effectively, of me helping myself with my debugging. If I put a field blah, blah, blah here, for example, it would tell me that I'd made a mistake in this situation, which is good. I'm trying to find these errors out earlier. So let's put go test in here and do the same for 1. And let's just quickly do as well. Let's hope my typing is good. Step and the same for the run as well. And here we want to be a bit careful because we've got effectively an argument that we need to take in here. So let's declare that argument as a field here, a definition field. And we're going to use exactly that same sort of interpolation that we did earlier on. There. So let's just ignore the fact that there's this error afterwards, and I'll gloss over that for now. Run, and now we're going to specify the argument as being workflow 1 in this situation. And let's just copy this. And then in workflow 2, we'll do the same. You can see as well how when I'm saving these files, my editor is automatically formatting them as well. So I'm not needing to worry about white space. So from a maintenance perspective, this is a whole lot easier. So now I've dried this up. So you can see that in each workflow, I'm reusing some local definitions. I'm instantiating them in slightly different ways in each situation. But if we had multiple workflows, potentially across multiple repositories, this would make it a whole lot easier. Totally. So Q commands, gen workflows. Fingers crossed. Oh, no changes in the YAML. That's fantastic. So that means with all that drying up, I still have exactly the same YAML. Let's just check that what I pushed up before. Yep, that's still green. More drying up. Let's push that up. It works. So what do we want to do now? Well, we haven't actually done the most important thing. We haven't added to one of our workflows something that, as part of CI, reruns qgen queue command to generate the workflow. So we don't know that the queue is effectively consistent with the YAML that we've committed. And that's a bit of a no-no. So what we want to do, let's actually make this part of workflow 2, just for the sake of it, okay? But it could be part of another workflow if we wanted to. So what we're going to do as part of that is we're going to create another step here. And we're going to call this, let's call this one install queue. And this is where we have just released, thank you to Moya, a company in Germany who created a first version of this action. And they've donated it to the queue project. It's the qlang setup queue command, and we only have version 0.0.1 at the moment. And what version do we want to use in this situation? We want to use the version that we've been using, which is 0.4.1 beta.6. So we're going to install queue in much the same way that we install Go. And we check out our code here, which is all fine. So then we're going to, what we need to do, we've run our tests here. So now we want to have another step down at the bottom here. And we're just going to call this regenerate YAML from queue. And what's this going to run? It's going to run queue command gen workflows. And then we want one final step. And we're going to check our commit is clean. I'm going to cheat in this situation here because typing this one out a bit tricky. Oi, what have I done here?
Well, you're typing this whole check commit is clean thing. I think there's so much repetition of people using and checking for a clean history where this would be a great step, right?
Nice.
Nice.
I've made an error earlier on. What have I done here? I've missed a comma up there. Fantastic. Yes, that. So let me just add the comma up there because I messed that off. So here we're installing queue here. We're regenerating the YAML from queue. And then finally, we're just checking that our commit is clean. Again, that is a very common snippet that should be sort of common across so many things. So let's do queue command gen workflows. Now there will be a difference there in workflow2.yaml because that should now have added in the steps that we've added in. Good. Add generation of queue from YAML. Now this is the one to actually check that it runs correctly. So let's jump into workflow 2 here and verify that this actually runs correctly. Whilst we're doing that, we can just sort of wrap up, Michael, because we've sort of given. Oh no, have we got a? What do I made a mistake. So if we have a look at workflow2.q, it of course needs to run that within a working directory of, have I got that right? Of .github workflows. Probably correct in that situation. Q command git commit -am fix up generation of queue from YAML. One should be good. Go back to workflow 2. Fingers crossed this time. This has been a bit of a lightning tour. Some things may have gone a bit too quick, and again, if that is the case, we can always come back in later live streams to go into this in a bit more detail. But hopefully, Michael, that's sort of given a bit of an overview from your perspective on how to actually start from an existing YAML workflow. Perfect, that actually worked. So now we're sure that this commit that I just pushed up is clean with respect to the YAML that is generated from the queue as well. Does that help to provide a bit of context then? If people wanted to, we could actually look at they can go to the qlang.org, GitHub, and then within internal CI, all of the Q project CI workflows are specified within that workflows. Happens to be a single file there, but you can see then it looks very similar in terms of the specification. So for tips and tricks on how to do things a bit more elaborately, maybe there are a few examples there. Anything else from your side, Michael?
No, this was fantastic. I think this really closes the gap that I had after watching your lightning talk. And obviously, timing-wise, we had to leave out some things. For example, hey, it would be great if I could reuse some of the Q command toolings that you built, right? So I don't have to reinvent the wheel here.
Yes.
And sharing and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think you're thinking about that at least, right?
Exactly, yeah. And I think the package management side of things is important. That's an important step from the reuse side of things. At the moment, this manual vendoring of things is clearly doesn't scale, and that's entirely obvious to us. And that's where a Go-like package management solution comes in to build on the existing module support that's there. So there are a number of rough edges, but I would encourage folks to give it a try. We're aware of a number of those rough edges. Please just reach out if people have any problems, and we can help to fix those up with especially if there are bugs within the Q side of things.
Mm-hmm. By the way, great feedback in the chat as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Apologies, it did feel a tiny bit rushed. Judging these things from a timing perspective is a bit tricky. Thank you for your being generous with your time today, Michael, as well.
Thanks, Paul.
You mentioned one just briefly in closing, sort of ideas for future live streams would be sort of tidying up any loose ends here that people might have. But also the Go Releaser project is another interesting example you mentioned, where effectively you've got a large configuration that's tough to specify. Maybe Q could help there. So I've exchanged a few messages with Carlos on that. So maybe that might be a nice idea for converting a project to be Q-based in order to help with the validation of configuration and things.
Great.
Good
work, Paul.
Thank you very much, Michael, for coming in. Yeah, look forward to it, and we'll speak soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.